Okay, we're a minute past, so why don't we go ahead and get started? Um, I will lead us through some quick housekeeping and intro stuff, and then we'll pass it off to our presenters to take us through the rest of the webinar. So welcome to everyone to the Collaborative Science for Estuaries webinar series. This is Nick Sobral with the Science Collaborative. Glad you can join us today. Today's webinar is part 2 of a two-part series sharing the latest research from the Pacific Northwest Blue Carbon Working Group, which has been bringing scientists, planners, policymakers, and others together for nearly a decade to identify and collaboratively fill priority blue carbon data gaps for the Pacific Northwest coastal wetlands. If you haven't already, feel free to chat amongst yourselves. Chat's open to everybody. Oh, actually, you know what? I think it's not yet, so let me make that open to everybody. So feel free to introduce yourself, tell people where you're coming from today, and you can use it to chat amongst yourselves during the presentation as well. So you'll hear more from some of the members of the project team in just a moment, but before we get started, I have a quick intro to the reserve system, the Science Collaborative, and this webinar series. So the National Estuarine Research Reserve System is a national network of 30 unique research reserves shown on this map. It's a NOAA program that works in collaboration with a local place-based partner, either a state agency, university, or nonprofit at each site. Each reserve site includes programs focused on the activities you see on the slide. So it's land stewardship, research and scientific monitoring, training programs for the public and local officials, and education. The Science Collaborative Program supports science for estuarine and coastal decision makers by coordinating regular funding opportunities and supporting user-driven collaborative research and transfer activities that address critical coastal management needs identified by the reserves. The webinar series features project teams supported by the Science Collaborative, program staff, and partners. Speakers share their unique approaches to addressing current coastal and estuarine management issues. And if that sounds interesting to you, please feel free to join us for future webinars to learn more about new methods to integrate experts and users into the research process and how their research results and products might inform your work. So with that, I will introduce our speakers. So today, to tell us more about collaborative blue carbon research in the Pacific Northwest, we'll be hearing from 4 people who have been doing this work. So joining us today are Chris Janousek, research professor at Oregon State University. We have a video clip from Jazmin Dagostino, who was not able to join us today, but she did send a nice video clip along, so we'll share that as well. Mackenzie Taggart is a associate at Sylvestrum Climate Associates, and Adrian Laufer, who is the CEO of Climate Sea and Shore Solutions. So to get us started, Craig Cornu, who has served as the PI on a number of blue carbon projects supported by the Science Collaborative, will set the stage by telling us about the context and the need for this most recent work. So Craig, over to you.
Hi, everybody. As Nick said, I'm Craig Cornu. I live in Coos Bay, Oregon, and I've been coordinating the Pacific Blue Carbon Working Group for a while. The working group is a diverse group of scientists, planners, policymakers, and others. And we've been taking a collaborative approach to filling blue carbon data gaps in our region since about 2015. And with the help of the NERRS Science Collaborative, we've organized a couple of webinars to share the progress we've made in filling those gaps, and also now beginning to facilitate the application of those data to the climate mitigation efforts of coastal planners, policymakers, and others, as well as applying those data to the development of some blue carbonate tools. As you may know, today's webinar is the second webinar. I think maybe Nick just mentioned that, and it's going to focus on those climate mitigation policy initiatives and tools that our data have been starting to facilitate. And you may know that we did the first webinar last week, which focused on the working group's blue carbon research efforts in support of these projects. And a recording of that webinar is available through the NERRS Science Collaborative folks in some way, shape, or form. And I think Nick will reinforce that. So with that, let's get started with Oregon State University's Chris Janousek, who will be telling us about his development and ongoing curation of the working group's blue carbon database that really ties all this research data and data application work together. So take it away, Chris.
Thanks, Greg. Great. Okay. I hope everyone can see that. So I'm Chris. I'm research faculty at Oregon State, and I've been working with Craig and others in the Pacific Northwest Blue Carbon Working Group for quite a while now. One of our initial goals in the working group was to develop a blue carbon database. So this will hopefully set the stage for some of the other presentations that you'll hear of today. The goal of the database really was to kind of bring together a lot of blue carbon data that we had for the Pacific Northwest into one working location that would support a lot of different applications for the data set. We started the database in about 2018 with funding from the Science Collaborative. And our initial buildup of the database was with our stocks project data that we collected specifically with NERRS Science Collaborative funding. And I spoke about that a little bit last week, if you were able to catch last week's webinar. After a while, we began to expand the blue carbon database throughout North America, included California, samples in Mexico, and then data that were starting to be compiled for British Columbia and Alaska. The database currently is a living database, so it's more of a working product than a final product. We're adding new data as it becomes available, and we're ensuring that data that's built up in the database is archived in locations that will be accessible long-term for individuals. And I'll talk about that kind of at the end of this presentation. When we thought about and conceived the database, we thought about a variety of objectives that it could fulfill, and I've just listed a couple of them here. This is sort of our initial thoughts and slightly modified over time. The database was meant to serve a variety of kind of data needs, and that includes summary data of stocks and sequestration by wetland type, by geographic subregion within the Pacific Northwest or the West Coast. The database is very helpful for identifying additional data gaps that we have yet to fulfill through research projects. The database could also be important for uncertainty analyses or regional inventories of blue carbon. And we were hoping with the database that we'd be able to serve the needs of a wide variety of users, so including researchers, wetland managers, restoration practitioners, even folks who are thinking about using blue carbon for mitigation or finance markets. This is just an overview of some of the kinds of data that we're collecting in the database. And so far, we've been able to compile over 70 sources of data. Most of these are published in one form or another, but some remain as unpublished data sets. And we have 4 potential types of blue carbon data that could go into the database. And we've really mainly focused on 3. So one is soil carbon stocks and nitrogen stocks. And that's sort of the most well-developed part of the database. And we have over 1,600 cores that comprise that piece of the database. We're also compiling soil accretion rate data, and those information are critical to understanding carbon sequestration. So we need to know the carbon density and the accretion rate, and then we can calculate sequestration rate information. Most recently, we've been working on greenhouse gas emissions data, so particularly methane, but also carbon dioxide and nitrous oxide. So the incorporation of those data into the database are ongoing. And then a potential future direction, which we really haven't tackled, although we do have some data on this, is plant biomass. So that's another kind of key component of the blue carbon in these ecosystems. Along with these types of blue carbon data, we're collecting a lot of ecosystem driver data. And this is really dependent on what's available. Not all studies measure all things. And so we have partial data sets for a lot of these variables, but we have the ecosystem type under consideration, geographic location. In many cases, we have the wetland elevation, so we know whether it's a low marsh or a high marsh, for example. We have information on the disturbance status, whether it's restored, highly disturbed in some way, or a relatively untouched, least disturbed wetland. We have some data on plant species composition, a little bit on salinity, and then in some cases we have grain size information as well. The database covers 5 major blue carbon ecosystems for the Northeast Pacific Basin. So it includes data on tide flats. These are areas generally without vascular plants, but may have algae. And we have actually found that they have sort of higher than expected carbon stocks in these ecosystems. Seagrass meadows, mangroves in Mexico, not in the US, of course, tidal marshes, and then tidal swamps, which are kind of one of our prized rare ecosystem types in the Pacific Northwest. We're also including data when available on former tidal wetlands. So these are areas that could have formerly been emergent marsh, for example, but are now in agricultural production or other uses. This gives you a snapshot of two of the types of data that two of the types of uses of data that we have in the database. These are more sort of research-oriented applications of the database. On the left is a figure of a synthesis we've done of the total carbon stocks in all of these ecosystem types for the whole Northeast Pacific region. So from southern Mexico all the way to Alaska. And I showed this figure in the presentation last week, so I won't belabor it, but we're finding large differences in the carbon stocks in the soils of these ecosystems, with marshes, mangroves, and tidal swamps really having the highest capacity for long-term carbon storage. Another application for more sort of research-oriented approaches is shown on the right. And this is an ongoing project that we have right now, where we're looking at carbon stocks and sequestration rates in some of the oldest tidal wetland restorations on the Pacific coast. So these are restoration sites that are at least 20 years old, but in some cases go back about 6 decades. So these are some of the pioneering and earliest projects on the West Coast. The red circles here indicate pairs of sites that we're looking at in the Pacific Northwest. And this project's also being conducted in the Bay Area in Southern California. So in each of these estuaries, we have an older restoration project. I've shown photographs of 2 here in Coos Bay and San Francisco Bay. And then these are paired with least disturbed nearby reference wetlands. And we're looking at sort of the long-term carbon sequestration potential. We're collecting new cores for this project, but the database is also a really key source of useful information to look at this, this large-scale project. Another use of the database is to inform sort of state-level projects. And I'll just go over these briefly because I think you'll hear a little bit more about some of these with subsequent presenters. But one application, for example, we've been working with Silvestrum to provide soil carbon stocks for determining statewide emissions for the state of Oregon. And this was done for multiple blue carbon ecosystems that we have. In California, we've also worked with Silvestrum to provide stocks, sequestration rate, and greenhouse gas emissions data in support of mapping efforts in Coos Bay specifically, and then for the full Oregon coast. And sorry, I misspoke, but finally for California, we've been working with the San Francisco Estuary Institute as well, SFEI, who need data on carbon accumulation rates for tide flat and seagrass ecosystems from other regions, because those data are sparse in California, but they can then apply those data to their work on estimating sequestration in California seagrass meadows. The final slide I'd really like to show is that in terms of applications of the data, is that we're working closely with the Smithsonian's Environmental Research Center's Coastal Carbon Network. And this is a network that they've built up that's now international. And they've pulled together a really large database of blue carbon information for the whole world, essentially. We have much more limited capacity in the Pacific Northwest to host a sort of a specific database and maintain that. So what we've been doing as we've built up our regional database is to work with the Smithsonian so that we can have long-term access to these data sets. So this just shows a couple of examples here of data sets that we have curated or facilitated the transfer of to the Smithsonian so that we have long-term archival of this information. So finally, in summary, before we move on to the next speakers, the database that we've been working on and building is a growing resource for a variety of applications along the Pacific coast of North America. We're open to sharing data, gathering new data when it becomes available, and this will hopefully be a very important means of support for blue carbon projects regionally. We're working with the Smithsonian, again, to ensure that these data are available long-term and a variety of users have access to the data. And we welcome new funding sources for the database. Again, this was supported initially by the Science Collaborative, but keeping the database managed and growing requires additional funding support. So if anyone has any questions, my email is here. And with that, I will move on to the next speaker.
Thanks, Chris. So I think I mentioned earlier that Jazmin is not able to join us today, but they did send along a video for us to enjoy, so I'll go ahead and share that. So this is from Jazmin Dagostino, who is a associate on the Pew Charitable Trust U.S. Conservation Project.
Hello, everyone. I'm Jazmin Dagostino, and I work for the Pew Charitable Trust's U.S. Conservation Project. Within this broader project, my team is focused on advancing conservation and restoration of coastal blue carbon habitats and peatlands as natural climate solutions for states to integrate into their climate planning. Pew works on a diverse range of issues in the U.S. and globally, spanning consumer policy, health, governance, and the environment. Our common thread across portfolios is advancing nonpartisan, evidence-based solutions to pressing policy challenges. Over the last 25 years, our environment portfolio has focused on pressing global environmental issues, spanning marine, terrestrial, and freshwater landscapes, including the conservation of coastal habitats, which I'll get into today. Natural and working lands include forests, wetlands, grasslands, and agricultural lands. And while they are definitely not a substitute for reducing the use of fossil fuels, improving the management of natural and working lands can be an important component of these climate response strategies. Over the past 3 years, states with climate goals are developing strategies for natural and working lands alongside other more traditional sectors like energy. So you may be wondering at this point, what are these natural and working lands plans? These plans identify and implement practices such as habitat restoration that reduce emissions, avoid emissions, and also help expand carbon sinks. So what are the components of these plans? These plans typically include a carbon assessment, which could entail more basic estimates of existing carbon stocks in the habitat to a more sophisticated inventory of greenhouse gas emissions and removals. These carbon assessments are then used to set targets and management strategies to move beyond the business as usual from a greenhouse gas perspective. These natural and working land strategies are relatively new, and when we first began working on blue carbon, we noticed coastal habitats were often overlooked within these plans. However, given the growing body of research on the climate mitigation benefits of coastal wetlands and also the advancements in greenhouse gas accounting methodologies, we saw an opportunity to work with states to measure and include blue carbon habitats into their natural and working lands plans. So we typically advocate for the inclusion of blue carbon habitats, as well as specific measures to better conserve and restore these ecosystems so as to maintain and expand them as carbon sinks. And of course, in addition to mitigating climate, coastal wetlands provide a host of other co-benefits, such as flood protection, water quality improvements, fish habitat, and recreation. Although every state where we work looks a little different, Pew focuses on convening experts, supporting research, and engaging in policy efforts. This chart is kind of a prime example of that. This is research conducted by the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center, which we supported to assess the state of blue carbon data along coastal states. This data also captured data collected by the Pacific Northwest Blue Carbon Working Group. Pew is currently engaged in Oregon, California, North Carolina, and New Jersey, which are all states developing natural and working lands plans and are interested in incorporating coastal habitats into these plans. I'll also note that Maine, Maryland, and Louisiana are active in the blue carbon space. So I'll dive deeper on Oregon, which is one of the first states to include coastal habitats into its natural and working lands climate planning. So beginning in 2021, the Oregon Global Warming Commission, which is now called the Climate Action Commission, began its development of a natural working lands proposal in response to an executive order by then Governor Kate Brown. PU collaborated with a number of stakeholders, including the Pacific Northwest Blue Carbon Working Group, Silvestrum, and the Oregon Coastal Management Program to create a carbon inventory and provide policy recommendations for the Commission to include in its final proposal. As a result of this work, the Commission did end up including blue carbon habitats in its scoping of specific climate smart management practices. And in a somewhat complementary move, the Oregon legislature passed a bill establishing natural and working lands as a pathway for the state to achieve its climate goals, with specific mention to blue carbon. This provided a kind of a basis or foundation for Oregon to develop and implement specific targets for conserving and restoring coastal habitats as part of their climate mitigation efforts. The Commission plan outlines recommended practices for tracking greenhouse gas mitigation over time in the state's natural and working lands. This slide highlights management practices for blue carbon that center around protection of existing habitats, so as not to lose what we already have, and also include actions related to building resilience to sea level rise and restoring habitats. Proposed metrics for measuring would ideally be changes in carbon stored, though acreage can also be a surrogate for this. The results of this project, alongside the bill that outlines key steps and includes a Natural Climate Solutions Fund, now serves as a foundation for Oregon to begin implementation of this work. So now heading to California, the state is on a similar track as Oregon, but following a more top-down approach because of new legal mandates to establish natural climate solution targets. Initially, the state included a target for wetlands, focusing on restoring brackish and degraded peat wetlands in the Sacramento Delta as part of its 2022 climate change scoping plan. An expert advisor committee set up to advise targets recently recommended expanded wetland goals, including blue carbon habitats. So that's great to hear. So I'll end here on the East Coast, finishing off with North Carolina, where I'm happy to report that the state has included coastal wetlands into their greenhouse gas inventory. The state began work on this natural and working lands inventory a few years back, and also developed a natural and working lands action plan to help advance the state's climate mitigation and resilience goals. As part of this work, they created a natural and working lands subgroup, including one devoted specifically to coastal habitats. So over the past few years now, we've worked with this group to develop a blue carbon inventory for the state, inclusive of seagrasses. So in addition, this inventory is helping the state include measures to conserve and restore coastal wetlands as part of their EPA Priority Climate Action Plan. These plans will enable the state to access EPA funding coming from the IRA for measures that show greenhouse gas mitigation benefits, including in natural and working lands. PU also works at the national level, including through our Blue Carbon Network that helps states learn and share information and strategies related to blue carbon. Blue carbon has also been a hot topic and elevated in various administration priorities recently. I'll note in particular the Ocean Climate Action Plan released in 2023, which set out ambitious recommendations for blue carbon across agencies. And finally, I'll end with flagging some hot topics that are bubbling up in our work. These may not be a surprise to folks on this call, but they include the need for finer resolution mapping and change data for coastal wetlands, a better understanding of what happens to blue carbon in the face of sea level rise, and also relatedly, how to advance comprehensive carbon and resilience strategies, how to account for the multiple benefits that these habitats provide, and finally, exploring, of course, other carbon sinks like peatlands. So that is it for me today. Huge thanks to the folks organizing this, and thank you for extending the invitation to present, even if it was through a recording. I have shared my email address on this slide. Feel free to reach out with any follow-up questions, and with that, I will turn it over to Mackenzie, who will be touching more on the development of the blue carbon mapping tool in Oregon.
All right. Big thank you to Jazmin for sending that in, and now it's over to Mackenzie.
Okay, hopefully this is showing up on the screen. Hello, everyone. My name is Mackenzie Taggart. I work for Silvestrum Climate Associates, and today, like Jazz mentioned, I'm going to be talking about scaling regional carbon stock data for estuary-level mapping tools and a carbon calculator for the state of Oregon. So some really exciting work. First up, all of this really started back in 2021 with the release of a white paper that discussed a coastal wetlands greenhouse gas inventory for Oregon. So this was developed by some of my colleagues at Silvestrum, along with individuals at the Pew Charitable Trust and those in the Pacific Northwest Blue Carbon Working Group. So it included a variety of coastal wetlands, carbon pools and fluxes, as well as area change. And building on this work, we've actually piloted an interactive blue carbon mapping tool specifically for Coos Bay to help users better visualize coastal wetland carbon stocks. So that's what I'll be presenting on today. And I'll also touch on the development of a blue carbon calculator for Oregon that is currently in development. All right, first up, we created what was called a current conditions layer for Coos Bay. So what this really is a modified CMEX biotic layer that was refined for Coos Bay specifically. And using this, we applied emissions and removals data. So this was refined because we wanted better representation for tidal forested as well as scrub shrub wetlands, which occur in Coos Bay. On the left of the screen, you can see the habitat and wetland types that we've included. Something to note is we're also including tidal wetlands that were former tidal wetlands, as well as pasture lands. And on the right, you'll see various carbon data that we have used to calculate these emissions and removals. All right, so let's jump into the data a bit. First up is soil carbon stock. So for this current conditions layer, we address soil carbon accumulation rates as well as soil carbon stock down to 1 meter depth. These were both stratified by wetland type, and they're provided in the table at the bottom of the slide. Soil carbon stock down to 1 meter was included for former tidal wetlands and pasture, but that was not the case for soil carbon accumulation. Next up is biomass. So this includes above ground biomass, below ground biomass, and dead organic matter. And this is from a study by Kaufman et al. Below ground biomass was calculated using the IPCC Tier 1 root to chute ratio. Some things to note, and you can see the table down at the bottom that provides our biomass data. There was no biomass available for scrub shrub wetlands, so instead we've substituted data from emergent wetlands. And for forested wetlands, we used data on upland Sitka spruce forests from Smith et al., a study, and that was specifically, we used the biomass accumulation curve, which was capped at the mean value shown on the table below, as well as the annual growth rate from that study. And the last piece of the data puzzle is methane data. So we've used the IPCC Tier 1 emission value of methane, which is shown right here as 2.195. And we also used a global warming potential of 28. Now, methane emissions were calculated for tidal emergent, scrub shrub, and tidal forested wetlands within this current conditions layer, and only if they had a salinity less than 18 PSU. So anything above 18 PSU was considered not to emit methane, anything below would. And site salinities were determined from an average surface level salinity for the month of October, which happens to be the highest salinity month for Coos Bay. All right, so pulling all of this fantastic data together, the final product is this interactive mapping tool that provides estimated carbon values per acre for 30 years. So there's a screen snipping of this on the right, and Adrian will talk about this in her presentation. But these carbon values reflect 30 years of fluxes, so that is your soil carbon accumulation along with methane, and that's been added to your total carbon stocks. So soil carbon down to 1 meter, your biomass, and your dead organic matter. And so this was calculated, these fluxes were calculated annually, multiplied by 30 years, and then summed to your total carbon stocks for all of the sites within the estuary. The second layer that we actually created is the restoration opportunity layer, or the ROI as we call it. And this was to enable users to assess restoration potential within Coos Bay estuary. So it includes recently restored sites as well as those with restoration potential. We source our pre-restoration site data from the current conditions layer that I just presented on. And for post-restoration, in order to determine what a wetland site was likely to restore to, we used the current tidal elevations for these sites. So down on the left, you can see we have 3 options for restoration. You could either turn into an emergent, a scrub shrub, or a forested tidal wetland. And on the right here, you can see how we kind of performed this tidal elevation analysis. So generally, if 50% of your site is at or below mean tide level, or between mean tide level and mean high or high water, you would restore into an emergent tidal wetland, and emissions and removals were calculated based on that. If your site was at or above mean high or high water, you could turn into either of all three of the sites potentially. So we've calculated emissions and removals for all three. So the carbon potential of a restored site is provided at 3 time intervals, and that's 15, 30, and 50 years. At the bottom of the screen, we've got a little bit of a range of these carbon values provided in units of CO2 equivalents per acre. And this is a range of values for all of the sites within Coos Bay Estuary that are included in this ROI layer. Now, we did have to make a few assumptions that are important to note. The first of which is that sites are considered non-tidal prior to restoration, and as such, they are considered to have methane emissions. Post-restoration, if a site had salinity above 18 PSU, avoided emissions are calculated, and that's because it's considered to not emit methane above the 18 PSU threshold. Soil carbon accumulation begins 5 years after restoration. Biomass for emergent wetlands and seagrass is assumed to cover the entire site and is only counted 1 time. And for forested wetlands, similar to the current conditions layer, the biomass follows the upland Sitka spruce growth curve, and this was sourced by Kaufman et al. Similarly to the current conditions layer, the mean value is capped as well. And the last thing I will share is a project that is currently in development, and it is the Oregon Blue Carbon Calculator. So this is building on that 2021 Coastal Wetlands Inventory for the state of Oregon, and it's funded through OWEB, and the calculator will enable users to calculate estimated greenhouse gas emissions and removals resulting from various land management activities. So examples of these activities include restoration and conservation, changes in wetland type, as well as various disturbances. So this could be excavation, draining, or filling of any of these habitats. It's going to be released as a spreadsheet as well as a publicly accessible online interface. So much like the map I presented on, or the data behind the map, it's going to be interactive for users, and it'll provide emissions and removals over a 50-year timeframe post-restoration. So once it's completed, we hope it will have a variety of benefits for our various end users, some of which we've listed here on the screen. We hope it will enable coastal planners to account for and consider greenhouse gas emissions with regards to land use and restoration. Wetland regulators could use this information to add greenhouse gas emissions and impacts to evaluations of current development sites and projects. And we're also hoping that it'll provide valuable data for carbon finance project planners as well. So quite a variety of end users. And with that, I will conclude my presentation. Thank you everybody for your time. Both my email and my colleagues are provided on the screen, and at the bottom we have some resources for you guys and valuable links. So thank you very much.
Okay, I believe next up we have Adrian Laufer. Adrian, are you ready? There you are.
Yes. Hi. Thanks so much, Mackenzie, for setting the stage there. That sets me up really nicely for my presentation here. Are you able to see it okay?
It looks good.
All right, great. So my role in this project was to take this amazing data that was created by Mackenzie and Craig and the rest of the team and turn it into a really useful and user-friendly online interface that could reach a wide variety of different audiences. So really great that I get to follow up after Mackenzie, recognizing that this tool that I'm about to be sharing is using all of the data that she was just talking about. Some acknowledgements to start us off. Pew Charitable Trusts who helped keep this project running, and also the Oregon Coastal Management Program and the Oregon Explorer, who were key partners in developing this tool and actually providing resources to host the tool and keep it running. So as I mentioned, our main goal here was to create a map tool that served a wide variety of users recognizing that folks across the spectrum of familiarity with blue carbon might be using this tool. So for example, we expect some folks who have very deep backgrounds, are restoration practitioners, perhaps using this tool to help gather information about a specific restoration project. There might also just be landowners who are curious about the type of blue carbon benefit on their land, especially in light of some of the new state policies related to climate action. So we wanted to create something that was useful among that entire spectrum. We also wanted to be really cautious to create a tool that effectively illustrated the multiple possible outcomes of restoration, recognizing that sometimes folks will see something on a map and take it as ultimate truth. But as we know from Mackenzie's presentation, there were a lot of assumptions that went into this work. And, just this analysis isn't enough to guarantee that a site may respond a certain way. So building in that uncertainty to help dissuade any misuse of this tool, or potentially taking this information a bit farther than it could reasonably be taken. So in terms of the tool users piece, we broke these tool users up into 3 different archetypes, from beginner, who has very little to no experience with GIS, all the way through to an expert, so someone who is maybe a GIS professional and uses it in their work. And for each of these users, created some different functionalities within the tool to help serve them. So for beginners, there are pre-made operations that are just point and click goals to make it as easy as possible to find some interesting information. For moderate users, we have some advanced tool functionality. So it's still within the tool. There's still a point and click, but just a little bit more advanced. And then for experts, we're just providing the data as a download so that they can download it and use it within their own GIS interface. In terms of illustrating multiple outcomes and making sure that we include uncertainty accurately, how we did this was there's no one restored layer. Instead, there are different layers based off of different habitat types that show what the value would be if the area were to restore to that particular habitat. And the reason we did this is that it forces users to think outside of the box of like, oh, this site could become a forested tidal wetland, or it could also become a scrub shrub wetland, or it could become an emergent wetland, and thinking about all of those different options. And then for managing uncertainty, if you've used a government or other online tool, you've definitely seen the splash screen, which is the first thing that pops up with all of the disclaimers, but I think those are really important and helpful. And then we made really clear in the tool what the different assumptions are about the data. And I'm actually going to turn this over now into the tool at some point so we can show exactly how those assumptions are shown within the tool. In terms of the technology, this is hosted on Oregon's GeoHub, which is provided by the state of Oregon, and posted through the Oregon Explorer, which is already a really well-known resource for data in Oregon. So we're just being able to leverage those existing platforms is really helpful. So the tool itself is located on the Oregon Explorer. Like I said, this is the page that you'll see to access the tool. I'm going to stop my video. Well, I stopped my video. I'm going to stop my sharing and actually transition to the tool itself and do a little bit of a live walkthrough. Are you seeing my internet browser right now?
Yep, we see it.
Okay, perfect. I'm going to put a link in the chat as well to anybody who maybe wants to explore this on their own, follow along. So here at the beginnings, the shapefile download for anyone who wants to put this into their own space. Opening up the tool here. This is how it first opens up. We have all the disclosure of limitations. This is a splash screen. All of the different types of data options are available in this panel that comes up. So clicking any of those will change the data available. Pop-ups, clicking on any of the site will again provide more information about that specific area. And just to give an example of how we did the assumptions here, clicking on one of these sites, let me make this a little bigger here so you can see. We have very clearly that says assumptions 1 through 5 apply. So this isn't necessarily what they're all going to say. For all of these, it says 1 through 5. And we can click the exclamation point right here to quickly see what all the assumptions are. For slightly more advanced users, we have a site report tool, which allows you to draw your own project area. Say we have a project right there, and create a site report that shows information about the site as it currently stands now, and then also includes restoration information 15, 30, and 50 years into the future. And this can be printed as a nice report. And we've already heard of some great case studies of folks using this to help bolster their protection and restoration projects. So I don't want to go too deep into this, make sure that we have time for questions. So I think I will end it here, and I'm happy to keep showing things around if folks have questions, but I also encourage you to look on your own and put questions in the chat if you come up with any. Thank you so much. I'll put my information in the chat too if anyone has any questions for me.
All right, thanks, folks. I do see some questions coming in the Q&A, and I see some of the presenters have already started answering some of those via chat, which you can totally do. Other folks, if you have questions, do feel free to keep them coming, and we'll see how many we get through before the time's up. Maybe while we're waiting for more questions, I can go through and kind of verbalize some of the ones that people are just listening along that have already been answered here. So I'll just go from the bottom. So somebody asked, last week researchers shared that methane emissions from restored wetlands were not well predicted by salinity and outpaced carbon dioxide sequestration. Is that part of the blue carbon calculator? And Chris answered, salinity is important for methane emissions, but we found that it is not the only important factor. For instance, the water table seems to play a major role. Others can chime in as well, but we are working on how to incorporate salinity into the calculator. Methane emissions may thus be different depending on a user input salinity value. Okay, next question that we had that has already been answered. Do you expect the blue carbon calculator could be applied outside Oregon, maybe in California? And Craig answered, the blue carbon calculator is actually considered a Pacific Northwest blue carbon calculator. So yes, the calculator should work for California. The regionally specific data supporting the calculator includes Northern California estuaries. Okay, other question that's already been answered. Will the blue carbon calculator in Coos Bay Mapper be updated based on the greenhouse gas emissions data shared in last week's seminar? Craig answered, the blue carbon mapping methods were specifically developed to make data updates easy to undertake, so the short answer is yes. Question is when. Additional blue carbon mapping is planned for other Oregon estuaries, and we're figuring out funding and how it'll happen, including data updates. Another question was, on what basis were non-tidal lands considered to release methane? If they were drained, then methane emissions could be negligible. And Chris answered, so we tend to have a broad spectrum of former non-tidal wetlands in the Pacific Northwest. Some are very dry, and they do have low methane emissions or even slight methane consumption. Others have very saturated soils and high methane emissions. We do have a new question that just came in. Are there other regional database development efforts analogous to the Pacific Northwest Consortium? For example, Gulf of Mexico, Hawaii, or other?
Yeah, I'll tackle that one. I think that there are some other regional efforts that are in kind of the nascent development stage, and there may be one for the Gulf of Mexico, and there may also possibly be one for the north sort of New England area. But again, I think I would refer anyone who has questions about blue carbon data outside of our coast to refer to them to the Smithsonian's database, because they really have built up an international database at this point. And I think they have maybe 8,000 cores now globally. So, you know, if you're interested in mangroves in the South Pacific or marshes in Georgia or South Carolina, you know, that can be a great resource for finding more information.
There's something else on that one. I did see somebody asked a follow-up question to a previous question. So the question about on what basis were non-tidal wetlands considered to release methane. So there was a follow-up question asking if it's valid to assign one single emission factor. I think that was in response to your response, Chris.
Yeah, no, probably it isn't. And I think, you know, I don't remember if this was specifically with respect to the calculator or one of the other products, but in the calculator, I can say, and this is, we just got started on the calculator project, so it's pretty ongoing, and we're sort of developing exactly how that's going to roll out. But we are considering, for example, different methane fluxes depending on the salinity of the system. And I imagine that we could also do that to, we could also apply differences in methane fluxes depending on the kind of former tidal wetland that is planned for restoration. So if it's a very wet site, for example, we would expect to go from high emissions to potentially lower emissions if the site becomes more drained after restoration. Conversely, if it's a very dry former tidal wetland, we wouldn't expect much baseline methane emissions there. So maybe Craig can answer this a little bit more.
Yeah, I was just going to say, if that question is specific to the mapping, I'll just say that we're just developing these methods in real time here, and the mapping project ended at a certain level of understanding of how we could make these estimates work, and we started up on the funding has a lot to do with that. Then we started up on the calculator project, and we're figuring out a lot more. We have the methane data now to work with on the calculator. All of this stuff that we figure out and learned along the way gets rolled back into subsequent mapping projects. So have some patience, everybody, as we sort of work these things out and do some adaptive methods development here that we hope we are able to get back and to sort of update things that we need to update as we go along. I hope that made some sense.
And got about 10 minutes left, folks, so do feel free to keep asking questions. In the meantime, I do see there were a couple questions that were given to us via the webinar chat, so maybe everyone didn't see all them. Attendees might not have seen them, I should say. So there was a question from Mackenzie about sea level rise scenarios included in the restoration opportunity calculation, and they wanted to know there could be knowledge. So the question was, were sea level rise scenarios included in the restoration opportunity calculation? If not, there could be knowledge benefits from coupling outputs with the outputs of a NOAA ESLR project of the Pacific Northwest Blue Carbon Working Group that ran sea level rise scenarios in, I can't see what that says, Delft 3D. The print is very small, so apologies. That paper is currently in review, led by Matthew Brand. So Mackenzie did answer, this is a wonderful question. In short, no, it did not assess sea level rise scenarios within the ROI layer. This is something the developers have discussed as a possibility for future versions. Thank you for sharing further information on Pacific and Northwest research into the topic. So thanks, folks, for that. And while we're waiting, I'll take the opportunity to thank our presenters for being with us today and for sharing all of our presentations and all their great work with everybody in the reserve system and beyond. So we always appreciate learning more about all the new work that's going on all over the place. And this is just like such a big project looking back over years and years and years that it's great to see all this stuff coming out of it now, all these uses and applications. It's really encouraging to see.
Yeah, and thanks, Nick and Megan, especially, and the Science Collaborative for facilitating this. This has been super helpful for getting us to this information out to folks. So thank you.
All right, folks, I'm not seeing any more questions, so I am happy to call it there. Again, thank you to our presenters for spending time with us today, and thank you all, folks, for joining us for a midday webinar. I know everyone's always super busy, so we always appreciate it when you decide to take an hour to spend it with us instead of, some other Zoom call with less fun and interesting people. I'm not biased at all. As we wrap up, like I said, just keep an eye out for all the webinar summary materials. They'll be available via our YouTube channel and our website. If you signed up for the webinar or you forwarded the link to somebody else who registered for the webinar, they'll automatically get an email that has the link to all that stuff in it, so you don't have to worry about it. I think that's it for now. So keep an eye out for future webinar announcements, and we'll see you in the next one. Thank you all.